What a moment. Man on the way to the moon.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're counting down our picks for 50 historical moments that shook the world to its core.
With the president's decision made and millions of lives on the line, the two most powerful countries in the world stared each other down at point-blank range.
Number 50, the Le Mans disaster. The Le Mans disaster on June 11, 1955 was easily one of the greatest tragedies in the history of modern sports. In a heartbeat, the world's most prestigious endurance race became a heartbreaking nightmare. At 125 miles per hour, Pierre Levesque's Mercedes collided with another car, launching whole chunks of his vehicle into the crowd. Shrapnel rained down like metal confetti, killing 83 spectators and the driver himself. The scene was chaos. Smoke, fire, and the eerie sound of silence that follows shock. Yet the race went on, as organizers feared that halting it would cause panic. The disaster forced motorsport to confront its recklessness, leading to sweeping safety reforms. Number 49, the Lockerbie bombing. Around 7 p.m. on the night of December 21, 1988, Pan Am Transatlantic Flight 103 was cruising over the small Scottish town of Lockerbie. It was on its way to a short stopover in New York on its way to Detroit.
The town is settling down as best it can to a tragedy which has destroyed Christmas for the community. Local people say they can hardly find the words to express their grief at a catastrophe many of them actually witnessed.
Suddenly, a suitcase bomb detonated in the cargo hold, shattering the jumbo jet into fiery fragments. All 259 souls aboard perished in an instant. 11 more on the ground were slain by fiery debris. The night sky burned, and the quiet town was strewn with devastation. Homes were crushed, fields set ablaze. The terrorist bombing spurred a relentless quest for justice, exposing a dark web of geopolitical intrigue. After a 3-year investigation, warrants were issued for a pair of Libyan nationals.
For some, the death of al-Megrahi, the only person ever to be convicted of the bombing, means that some of the questions over what happened may never be answered. But the truth is, his passing doesn't change any of this.
Number 48, the Tunguska event. At a sleepy dawn on June 30th, 1908, a massive explosion flattened over 800 square miles of remote Siberian forest. The force snapped 80 million trees like matchsticks.
A shockwave circles the world, leaving its mark on seismographs everywhere. But no one can understand where it has come from. It is 20 years before Soviet scientists discover the true scale of the disaster.
Witnesses spoke of a blinding light, a deafening boom, and a searing heat wave. Yet no crater was ever found. Was it a meteor? A comet? An alien ship gone rogue? Theories abound, but no answers are certain. What is clear is the power unleashed. Estimates place the blast at somewhere between 3 and 50 megatons of TNT, rivaling many nuclear blasts of the 20th century.
They say that the Tunguska explosion had the force of more than 1,000 Hiroshimas. Millions of pine trees, larches and birches are destroyed by the pressure wave and the fires.
The Tunguska event left few possible casualties, just a haunting reminder of nature's potential fury and a question mark etched into Earth's history. Number 47, Freddie Mercury dies of AIDS. Freddie Mercury, the electrifying frontman of Queen, was diagnosed with AIDS in April of 1987 after battling symptoms for years.
He was obviously suffering, and we didn't know what it was, and rumor. And so he did sit us down at one point and he said, look, you probably know what I'm going to say. You know what I'm suffering from. You know what the problem is, but I don't want to talk about it anymore.
Mercury kept his diagnosis quiet for the next 4 years. On November 24, 1991, Mercury's voice, once capable of shaking stadiums and hearts alike, fell silent. The man who gave us Bohemian Rhapsody and We Are the Champions left a legacy of unapologetic brilliance, flamboyance, and raw talent. His death was more than the end of a musical era. It spotlighted the devastating toll of the AIDS epidemic, igniting global awareness and empathy. Fans lit candles and blasted Queen anthems into the night. They mourned a legend, a force of nature whose music will forever keep us rocking.
Fans at his home in West London mourned the best-known British star to have died from the disease. But AIDS charities believe his greatest gift to his fans was to have openly admitted he was a sufferer.
Number 46, the Chilean mining accident. Trapped 2,300 feet underground for 69 days, 33 Chilean miners turned a nightmare into a global story of hope. After the San Jose mine collapsed, the men rationed food, sang songs, and clung to survival in suffocating darkness.
The 33 miners have endured a hellish 2 months in the sweltering, claustrophobic confines of the collapsed mine. 90-degree heat, 90% humidity.
Above ground, engineers and rescuers raced against time, drilling through solid rock to send supplies. Eventually, they sent in the Phoenix capsule, a tiny metal lifeboat that became their lifeline to the surface. When the first miner emerged, caked in dust but alive, cheers echoed around the world. One by one they rose, each rescue a victory over despair.
Again and again and again. Prayers answered.
Number 45, the Bhopal disaster. Imagine waking up in the dead of night to discover that the very air around you had turned deadly. This was the fate of Bhopal, India, the night of December 2nd to 3rd, 1984.
The scenes are simply hellish. So much suffering from India's invisible killer. At one point, an official said one death was being recorded every minute from the poison gas leak in the city of Bhopal.
A Union Carbide pesticide plant leaked tons of methyl isocyanate gas, creating a silent, invisible killer. Thousands died in their sleep. Others woke to burning lungs and blinded eyes, stumbling through streets filled with chaos and despair. By morning, thousands of lives were lost. The death toll climbed to tens of thousands in the years that followed.
In Bhopal today, the survivors of the poison gas disaster were visited by Nobel Peace Prize winner Mother Teresa.
At 74, she is bent but hardly broken by what she has seen. She tries to comfort by listening. These men saying, "We can hardly see anymore."
The disaster left a scar that would never fully heal. It was one of the deadliest industrial tragedies in history, a haunting reminder of the catastrophic cost of negligence. The poison lingered long after the gas cleared. Number 44, the Fukushima nuclear disaster. When the Earth shook off Japan's coast on March 11, 2011, the disaster didn't stop there. A tsunami surged inland, devastating towns and overwhelming the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant.
The tsunami flooded the nuclear power plant. Result? Massive overheating, and reactors 1, 2, and 3 suffered meltdowns.
The seawater breached defenses, flooded reactors, and triggered a nuclear meltdown. Radioactive plumes were released into the air. Entire communities were forced to flee, leaving behind homes and memories. The disaster was a cascade of failures, natural, human, and technological, that reignited fears of nuclear energy worldwide. Cleanup efforts continue to this day, a stark reminder of the delicate balance between progress and peril.
Agriculture and the Daiichi plant were once at the heart of Fukushima's local economy. Now the unusable land is being transformed to create clean energy and a potential new source of income.
Number 43, Nelson Mandela's passing. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison fighting apartheid. When he was finally released from his unjust imprisonment, he emerged with a vision of unity instead of bitterness.
And in 1990, the once young, strong boxer was released, emerging as a slow-moving statesman, blinking into the bright light of freedom.
From revolutionary to reconciler, he became South Africa's first black president, a symbol of justice and forgiveness. He died December 5, 2013 at the age of 95. His passing was viewed by many around the world as the loss of humanity's greatest moral compass. Leaders from every corner of the planet gathered to honor him.
But the world couldn't let go. The calls kept coming, to advise, to speak out, to just be that calming, kind presence. And truthfully, he obliged, always seemingly beaming.
100,000 mourners paid respect as his body laid in state. His funeral wasn't just the passing of a single man, but of an era in human history. Number 42, the Black Death. In the mid-14th century, death rode comfortably on the backs of fleas and rats. Beginning in Asia, the bubonic plague eventually spread to northern Africa and Europe.
People in harbor towns, then inland villages and towns, fell terribly, horribly ill.
It became known as the Black Death. The pandemic killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people, including as much as half of Europe's population. Some believe the toll may have been as high as 200 million worldwide. Lymph nodes swelled, fevers raged, and despair gripped every village and city it touched. Streets overflowed with bodies as fear and superstition replaced reason. The plague didn't just decimate populations, it shattered feudal systems, transformed economies, and rewrote the social order.
Those who survived began to question the authority of the bishops and the nobles. With so many dead, there were labor shortages across Europe. The workers who were left demanded higher wages, but were refused. By the end of the 14th century, peasant revolts broke out in Italy, France, and England.
Survivors faced a changed world, one where labor had new value and religion faced new doubt. Number 41, the Rwandan genocide. The world learned a harsh lesson in the spring and summer of 1994. It only takes 100 days to commit a massive genocide. Triggered by the assassination of President Juvenal Habyarimana, violence spread quickly.
When the president's plane crashed, Hutu extremists blamed the RPF and started a campaign of slaughter.
Extremist Hutu militias slaughtered some 800,000 people, mostly Tutsi men, women, and children, along with moderate Hutus who opposed the violence. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Machetes became tools of annihilation. The international community largely watched in silence, frozen by bureaucracy and indifference. Only after the bodies filled rivers and villages lay in ruins did the world begin to reckon with its failure. Rwanda emerged scarred but determined, and has attempted to rebuild from ashes.
I too am reconciling with my home. And like many Rwandans, I can see glimpses of hope, of strength, of resilience.
Number 40, Haiti earthquake. The centuries-long history of the island nation of Haiti has been one filled with tragedy and sorrow. Even so, neither the country nor the world at large were prepared for the scope of the 2010 disaster. On January 12th, the ground beneath Haiti shook with catastrophic force.
A magnitude 7.0 is a very major quake. And this one was shallow and, of course, as you've noted, near a very large population center. So we have, unfortunately, the feeling that this is going to be a very devastating event.
A magnitude 7.0 earthquake struck near the capital, leveling buildings and with casualties estimated by some at 230,000 lives. The devastation was immense. Hospitals crumbled, schools collapsed, and entire districts were reduced to rubble. Survivors faced unimaginable conditions. Food, water, and shelter were scarce. Aftershocks rattled their fragile hope. International aid poured in, but corruption and logistical challenges hampered recovery.
Much of the funds never reached Haitian hands.
The quake exposed deep-rooted poverty and systemic vulnerability, turning a natural disaster into a humanitarian crisis. Number 39, the Sputniks. In today's modern society driven by satellite technology, it can be hard to imagine the significance of Sputnik. Launched by the Soviet Union on October 4, 1957, Sputnik 1 became the first human-made object to orbit Earth.
Until 2 days ago, that sound had never been heard on this Earth. Suddenly, it has become as much a part of 20th century life as the whir of your vacuum cleaner. It's a report from man's farthest frontier, the radio signal transmitted by the Soviet Sputnik.
Its beeping signal, simple yet profound, echoed around the globe, marking the dawn of the space age. For the first time, humanity looked skyward not for stars, but for something of its own creation. The tiny satellite orbited for just 21 days before its batteries died, but its impact was seismic.
Sputnik sent a shockwave through America and the world, not because of what it did, but because of what it meant.
Americans from Maine to California trembled with fear about what this might mean for the future. Sputnik was the starting gun for the space race. Number 38, the invasion of Iraq. After quickly unseating the Taliban after the 9/11 attack, much of the world assumed that America's thirst for vengeance was slaked. But as 2002 progressed, it was clear that the U.S. government was laying the groundwork for invading Iraq as well.
The Americans called the massive air raids with which they opened the war shock and awe. They claimed, wrongly, that this was the way to make the Middle East safer for everyone.
In March 2003, the United States and its allies launched a shock and awe campaign, beginning the invasion of Iraq. It was framed as a mission to disarm Saddam Hussein of weapons of mass destruction. After the swift removal of Saddam's Ba'athist Party, the war quickly spiraled into a protracted conflict. Despite the lack of WMD, American forces remained. Years of chaos followed. Insurgency, sectarian violence, and a humanitarian crisis took the lives of tens of thousands and completely unsettled the region.
It was intervention on a dramatic scale, and while it destroyed Saddam's Ba'athist state, the struggle to define a new Iraq continues.
Number 37, the Mumbai attacks. On November 26, 2008, terror struck the heart of Mumbai. 10 militants from the Lashkar-e-Taiba organization launched a coordinated assault across the city.
This was terror that came from the sea.
Rubber boats were apparently used to ferry the attackers ashore, possibly from this Indian fishing boat, which was reported hijacked. Once ashore, the attackers fanned out toward their planned targets.
They targeted luxury hotels, a train station, a cafe, and a Jewish center. For 3 harrowing days, gunfire and explosions turned sections of Mumbai into war zones. When the dust settled, 166 victims had perished with hundreds injured.
The Battle of Mumbai lasted 3 days. It may take a lot longer than that to piece together exactly how it was planned.
The world watched as hostages were taken, landmarks burned, and the iconic Taj Mahal Palace Hotel became a battlefield. Amid the carnage, stories of bravery emerged. Hotel staff shielded guests. First responders risked their lives. Ordinary citizens aided strangers. Number 36, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappears. Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 vanished without a trace, leaving 239 passengers and crew lost to one of aviation's greatest mysteries. Departing Kuala Lumpur for Beijing, the plane's communication systems went silent.
The Beijing-bound flight departed Kuala Lumpur and was scheduled to land in Beijing at 6:30 a.m. It went missing 2 hours into the flight.
It veered off course, disappearing from radar. Despite a massive international search spanning the Indian Ocean, only scattered debris has ever been found. The disappearance became a media phenomenon. Cable news networks devoted round-the-clock coverage to the event. Social media became a breeding ground for conspiracies. The cause of the disappearance remains unknown, though theories abound.
This broken bit of airplane wreckage, more than 6 feet long, washed up on the French island of Reunion in the Indian Ocean. A first step toward closure for the families who've had no real answers until now.
Some speculate mechanical failure, others an attack or sabotage. No answers have surfaced. Number 35, the Charlie Hebdo shooting. The Paris office of Charlie Hebdo became a scene of terror on January 7, 2015. 2 gunmen stormed the building, killing 12 people, including renowned cartoonists and staff.
Shortly after this morning's attack, the French president came to issue a message of defiance on behalf of his nation.
The attackers, claiming allegiance to al-Qaeda, targeted the satirical magazine for its controversial depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. The assault was swift and brutal, leaving France shaken. In its aftermath, the world grappled with the balance between free expression and religious sensitivity. The attack became a symbol for the conflict between Western populations over immigration.
After the worst attack in decades in France, massive vigils overnight, so many people pouring into the streets to show their support. Just moments ago, a moment of silence at Notre Dame, right in the center of Paris.
Millions marched under the banner, Je suis Charlie. Number 34, the death of the King of Pop. The King of Pop's final curtain call came on June 25, 2009, when Michael Jackson was pronounced dead at just 50 years old. News of his passing spread like wildfire, stopping the world in its tracks.
It was an announcement that shocked the world. Michael Jackson dead at 50 years old.
I couldn't believe that I was announcing my brother's death for the world.
A cardiac arrest, later linked to an overdose of prescription drugs, ended the life of a man who redefined music, dance, and fame. Jackson's influence was unparalleled, and he was arguably the most famous celebrity on the planet. But Jackson's life was as complicated as his genius, marked by controversy and scandal. His death became a moment of collective reflection. Millions debated his legacy and mourned the end of both a performer and a cultural phenomenon.
Sorrow, shock, and so many unanswered questions.
Number 33, the sinking of the Titanic. The Titanic, hailed as the unsinkable marvel of the modern age, met a tragic fate on its maiden voyage.
It's the most infamous ship in all history. The Titanic.
Striking an iceberg in the icy North Atlantic on April 14, 1912, the luxury liner sank beneath the waves, taking over 1,500 lives with it. What began as a symbol of human ingenuity turned into a haunting reminder of its hubris. The lifeboats were too few, the warnings unheeded, and the icy waters unforgiving.
The shipbuilders believed that they had thought of everything when building the Titanic, but they were sadly mistaken.
Survivors told tales of bravery and despair, of a band playing as the ship disappeared into the night. The sinking of the Titanic was more than a maritime disaster. It was a watershed moment. Its sinking led to the creation of the International Ice Patrol and stricter lifeboat regulations worldwide. Number 32, the Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami. Christmas of 2004 was an unhappy moment for a large swath of the planet. On December 26th, a massive undersea earthquake, registering a magnitude of 9.1, unleashed towering waves that crashed into coastlines across more than a dozen countries, from Indonesia to Somalia.
It started with an undersea earthquake, one of the biggest in recorded history.
Entire towns were swept away, and over 230,000 lives were lost. The devastation was unimaginable. Homes were obliterated, families torn apart, and survivors left clinging to wreckage. The global response was unprecedented. Billions of dollars in aid and support poured into the nations affected.
The response of the international community was quick, with over $14 billion donated in humanitarian aid. But has that been enough to deal with the problems of those most affected?
It was a stark reminder of nature's raw power. Thankfully, it was also a unifying moment, as the world banded together to rebuild from the depths of the ocean's fury. Number 31, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. As tenuous as the world may seem today, remember, in 1914, the death of one man was the fallen domino that dragged the entire world into war.
Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Today, he will be assassinated. This is the spark which will ignite the First World War.
As the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Franz Ferdinand's death at the hands of a Bosnian Serb nationalist was a disaster. What seemed like a localized act of rebellion escalated as alliances were invoked. Within weeks, Europe was engulfed in war. Interests in Asia, the South Pacific, and Africa drew more colonial powers into the conflict.
Just 6 weeks after a man was killed by a single bullet, the alliances were triggered. Germany invaded France, and the First World War had begun.
The assassination exposed a powder keg. Ethnic rivalries and imperial ambitions were all just waiting for a spark. The bullets fired in Sarajevo didn't just end a life, they ended an era, unleashing chaos that would reshape the course of history. Number 30, the Israel-Hamas War. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been ongoing for 3/4 of a century, with the 2023 Israel-Hamas War adding another tragic and bloody chapter.
There are so many families across Israel asking, where was the army? Why didn't they stop this? What do you tell those families?
I tell them it's the responsibility of the army. It's the responsibility of the army for the intelligence. It's our responsibility to guard the people of Israel. We failed on Saturday. This is our responsibility. But now we're fighting.
This latest conflict began when the Palestinian political and militant group Hamas launched a surprise attack on the 7th of October 2023, killing around 1,200 Israelis, mostly civilians. They also took 250 Israelis hostage, demanding the release of Palestinian prisoners.
This is a massive terrorist attack that is gunning down Israeli civilians in their towns, in their homes, and as we've seen so graphically, literally dragging people across the border with Gaza.
In retaliation, Israel dropped 6,000 bombs on Gaza over 6 days and launched a ground invasion. As of late 2024, over 45,000 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed, most of them women and children. There have been widespread global protests, and Gaza has collapsed into a humanitarian crisis. Number 29, the Tiananmen Square protests and massacre. In China, references to this event, also known as the June 4th incident, are heavily censored. In the spring of 1989, student-led demonstrations were held in Tiananmen Square, Beijing, calling for democracy and greater civil liberties.
They turned Tiananmen Square, the country's symbol of sovereignty, into a hub of dissent and protest. They want a crackdown on corruption. They want freedom of press. They call for an awakening to reform and progress in China.
The protests spread to hundreds of cities, with workers joining them, angry over inflation, corruption, and the erosion of welfare. Declaring martial law, the government sent soldiers and tanks into the square. The death toll is disputed, ranging from hundreds to thousands.
Estimates run from several hundred to over 10,000. Some argue that by shooting at civilians, the Communist Party lost its legitimacy to rule, and with it, an opportunity for political modernization.
Famously, at least outside of China, the photo of an unknown man facing off against a column of tanks has become an enduring symbol of the event. Today, public displays of mourning for the victims are banned, although commemorations still sometimes reportedly occur in secret. Number 28, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Also known as the BP oil spill, this unfortunately wasn't the first industrial disaster to devastate our marine habitats, but it remains the largest on record. It began on April 20th, due to an explosion on the Deepwater Horizon oil platform.
And there's 30,000 of these workers every day that go in the Gulf to do this work, and they're well trained, but and they work to try to not have these accidents. But on this day, something went wrong, and now we're working with BP and we're Transocean to try to find the cause.
The fallout from this disaster resulted in 205 million gallons of oil discharged into the Gulf of Mexico, and effects were still being felt years after the initial disaster.
Birds are still on these islands coming in here feeding. So you can just imagine the contamination that takes place within the wildlife.
In fact, reports from 2012 stated that the oil refineries from Deepwater Horizon were still leaking, despite an official statement from 2010 that claimed the well was sealed. Number 27, the Oklahoma City bombing. This domestic terrorist attack shocked the nation. On April 19, 1995, anti-government white supremacists Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols detonated a truck full of explosives in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City.
In a blink, the sky dark with a plume of deep black smoke.
There was a tremendous explosion, a massive explosion at the federal building in the center of the city, the A.P. Murrah building.
We have a large column of smoke to be south of this address. Are you going to check on that?
The explosion killed 168 people and injured 680 others. The Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building was left in ruins, and the force of the blast damaged cars and buildings over a dozen blocks away. McVeigh and Nichols had sought to spark a revolution.
McVeigh became disaffected, latching onto a growing pro-gun, anti-government ideology that gained traction in the 1990s in the aftermath of federal law enforcement actions at Ruby Ridge, Idaho.
To this day, it is the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in United States history. Number 26, the Iran hostage crisis. In 1953, British and American intelligence agencies orchestrated a coup against democratically elected Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized Iran's oil industry. With U.S. support, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi became Iran's true ruler.
The Shah's power is maintained by a vicious secret police and the fifth largest military on Earth, equipped with American weapons.
Fast forward to the Islamic Revolution of 1979, and the Shah, seen as a Western puppet, was overthrown, replaced with the theocratic government of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. In the middle of this revolution, militarized college students took 52 Americans hostage in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. For over a year, President Jimmy Carter sought to negotiate their return, but only after 444 days were they released, after a pledge from the U.S. not to intervene in Iranian affairs.
It was a long and harrowing ordeal for the hostages, their families, and indeed the entire nation. And it was an ordeal that plagued the presidency of Jimmy Carter, an ordeal whose final resolution eluded his presidency by less than an hour.
Number 25, the November 2015 Paris attacks. As mentioned earlier, in January 2015, France was left reeling from an Islamic terrorist attack on satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, in which 12 staff were killed. Several other smaller attacks occurred throughout the year. On November 13th, these culminated in by far the deadliest. That night, in a series of coordinated attacks, terrorists detonated explosive vests and opened fire in streets and public venues in Paris.
Only minutes later, gunmen opened fire on several bars and restaurants in eastern Paris.
3 gunmen stormed a concert at the Bataclan Theater, killing 90 people. In all, 130 lives were taken. The attacks sent shockwaves not only through France, but also reverberated around the world. Number 24, John Lennon is assassinated. It's safe to say that John Lennon is one of the most influential singer-songwriters of all time. Even after leaving the Beatles in 1969, he enjoyed enormous popularity and success. He also became well known for his activism.
Is there not a more positive way of demonstrating in favor of peace than sitting in bed with 3 square meals a day?
Very positive.
However, on December 8, 1980, obsessive fan Mark David Chapman fatally shot him outside the Dakota Apartments in New York City. When news broke on ABC's Monday Night Football, fans were shocked and horrified. For many, the world seemed to stop turning.
An unspeakable tragedy confirmed to us by ABC News in New York City. John Lennon,
outside of his apartment building on the west side of New York City. The most famous, perhaps, of all of the Beatles, shot twice in the back.
Around the globe, fans were united in mourning for a man whose music meant so much to so many. Number 23, Hurricane Katrina. This Category 5 hurricane was devastating not only due to its intensity, but also a failure of flood control systems and slow government response. On August 29, 2005, the hurricane made landfall in Louisiana.
It was quickly predicted to become a catastrophic event.
My fear is absolutely that the models are correct.
It is gaining strength again. It is now stalking the Gulf Coast.
It rapidly doubled in size and intensified into a Category 5 hurricane.
The storm surge breached New Orleans levees and flooded the city. Tens of thousands of residents had not evacuated. It didn't matter if you were from there. TV and radio audiences could feel the distress and panic in the air. Critics argued that race and class were factors in the slow local and federal response.
This story ends up being the roadmap, the instruction booklet, the how-to story of dealing with disaster. It also tells you what not to do.
The hurricane left an estimated 1,392 dead in its wake, making it one of the deadliest in U.S. history. Number 22, the fall of Saigon. Seeing photos of the fall of Saigon, you might be reminded of the more recent 2021 Kabul airlift in Afghanistan. Both involved scenes of panic and powerful images of last-minute evacuation.
The hardest part was the waiting. Many people said it was unnerving to be waiting for a ride to safety and to be hearing fighting all around you.
On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, marking the end of the deadly and divisive Vietnam War. The iconic photo of a helicopter evacuation from the roof of the U.S. Embassy symbolized the desperate and dramatic nature of the fall.
Yes, we've chosen to leave, but we've chosen to leave because it's no longer defendable with the resources that we have chosen to commit, and the limits that we have put on our involvement in South Vietnam.
In the aftermath, Vietnam was reunified under communist rule, and the U.S. began to significantly rethink its foreign policies. Number 21, the Jonestown Massacre. Founded in Indiana in 1954, Jim Jones's People's Temple preached a message nominally based on Christianity, socialism, and civil rights.
His driving force was less the Bible than social justice. He was very much ahead of the current climate in terms of race relations and his desire to create an integrated society.
But something very dark lurked under the surface. In the 1970s, Jones fled accusations of abuse and fake miracles to a remote settlement in Guyana. Over time, the charismatic leader became paranoid and obsessed with domination over his faithful. Further reports of abuse led to a fact-finding mission from U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan. He never returned, murdered by Jones's Red Brigade. Jones ordered his over 900 followers, a third of the miners, to take their own lives by drinking flavor aid laced with cyanide.
This time, Jones served a punch spiked with cyanide. More than 900 died.
The tragedy left the public in shock and horror, and is the origin of the expression drinking the Kool-Aid. Number 20, Nelson Mandela released. In 1964, South African revolutionary leader Nelson Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment. 4 years, he had fought against apartheid, the system of racial segregation that privileged the country's white population and disenfranchised people of color. Even from prison, he remained committed to this cause, communicating with political leaders and gaining worldwide attention.
The fact that you could sit alone and think gave us a wonderful opportunity to change ourselves, your behavior.
As civil unrest grew, Mandela was finally released from prison in 1990, 27 years after he was sentenced. His release was broadcast around the world.
Heroic sacrifices have made it possible for me to be here today.
In a historic speech, he affirmed his commitment to peace, but also to the ongoing struggle against the violence of apartheid. Just 4 years later, he would go on to become the country's first black president. Number 19, the 2021 United States Capitol attack. On January 6, 2021, scenes of carnage in the U.S. Capitol, Washington, D.C., shocked Americans watching the riot unfold on TV. USA! USA! At a rally before the attack, outgoing President Donald Trump told supporters the election had been stolen and urged them to march to the Capitol building. Debunked by courts, state audits, and federal agencies, this claim was part of a campaign to overturn the election results and reinstall Trump as president.
This was a fraudulent election, but we can't play into the hands of these people.
Within hours, 2,000 angry Trump supporters broke into the Capitol building, assaulting police and searching for lawmakers gathered to formalize Joe Biden's victory. Among them were members of far-right militias and neo-fascist groups, some of them armed. The insurrection failed, with lawmakers racing to safety before the mob reached them. Number 18, the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. There were a lot of eyes on Cape Canaveral, Florida when Challenger finally launched on January 28, 1986. Due to technical issues and bad weather, the flight had been delayed multiple times.
Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
On launch day, CNN broadcast live nationwide coverage. NASA had organized for children to watch from schools to promote their Teacher in Space project, which had added teacher-turned-astronaut Krista McAuliffe to the crew. But viewers' hopes turned to horror as the shuttle disintegrated during its ascent, claiming the lives of all 7 crew members.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded.
The Challenger's final flight had lasted only 73 seconds. Number 17, the 1972 Summer Olympics. The 1972 Olympic Games in West Germany were the first to be held in the region since Nazi dictator Adolf Hitler used the event as a platform for propaganda in 1936. Sadly, the September Games would become even more infamous, etching out their own bleak mark in history. After infiltrating the Olympic Village, 8 armed men from the Palestinian terrorist group Black September killed 2 Israeli Olympic team members and took 9 more hostage.
The terrorists want hundreds of Palestinian prisoners released from Israeli jails. Nothing else will do.
After 2 grueling days of negotiation, the hostage crisis was brought to a violent end. The rescue attempt was botched, claiming the lives of all hostages and a police officer. Number 16, the O.J. Simpson murder trial verdict. It was the trial of the century, and the verdict left the public reeling.
Remember these words. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit.
After Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ron Goldman were stabbed to death in June 1994, Brown's ex-husband, former footballer and actor O.J. Simpson, became the prime suspect. Before her death, Brown had said that Simpson had abused and threatened to kill her. Every aspect of the case was highly publicized, from the car chase that saw him arrested to the lengthy trial. The coverage hooked viewers, and everyone had an opinion. On October 3, 1995, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Orenthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder.
For some, it was a vindication. To others, a travesty of justice, in which a celebrity had gotten away with murder. Number 15, the death of Osama bin Laden. In the wake of the September 11th attacks in 2001, U.S. President George W. Bush announced the beginning of a war on terror. The first stage of this war was the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan to hunt down Osama bin Laden and his terrorist group, Al-Qaeda.
In this conflict, America faces an enemy who has no regard for conventions of war or rules of morality.
This manhunt continued for almost a decade as bin Laden evaded capture. However, in 2011, the CIA tracked him down to a compound in Pakistan. In a helicopter raid codenamed Operation Neptune Spear on May 2nd, bin Laden was killed.
After a firefight, they killed Osama bin Laden and took custody of his body.
For those who vividly recalled the events of 9/11, President Obama's announcement that the Al-Qaeda leader was dead was a landmark event. Number 14, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. For months, the buildup of Russian forces along Ukraine's border had the world on edge. Would Russian President Vladimir Putin really give the order to invade? In 2014, Ukrainians had revolted against a pro-Moscow government, sick of corruption and abuse of power. Their success led Russia to annex Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula. In February 2022, Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, furious at the country's aspiration to join NATO.
I consider it necessary to immediately recognize the independence and sovereignty of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics.
In response, the international community hit Russia with severe economic sanctions. Around the world, everyone's eyes have been glued to their screens, watching the outgunned Ukrainians hold off the invading forces.
If we don't stand up, we don't have a country to defend.
Number 13, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech may be remembered for just 4 words, but they are arguably among the most powerful ever spoken.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
The Baptist minister had chosen his profession because he felt sermons were, quote, a respectful force for ideas, even social protest. King oversaw the Montgomery bus boycott and became the leader of civil rights organization SCLC. In August 1963, he helped organize a march of 250,000 people to Washington, D.C. to peacefully protest for equal rights for African Americans.
With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood.
On the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, he told listeners that he dreamt of a world free of racism and oppression. His impassioned words were heard far and wide, becoming a defining moment in the civil rights movement. They remain iconic today.
Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California.
Number 12, the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. Although she was no longer Her Royal Highness in 1997, having lost her title after her divorce from Prince Charles, Diana remained a popular figure for the Commonwealth and beyond.
We interrupt this film to tell you we are getting reports that Diana, Princess of Wales, has been badly injured in a car crash in France.
Her sudden death in a car accident as she fled paparazzi occurred in the early hours of August 31st, while the British public were still asleep. Diana's driver, who had been intoxicated at the time, and Egyptian producer Dodi Fayed also died in the crash. When people in the UK woke and learned the news, the country was left shocked and in mourning. The death of the people's princess was felt around the world.
Goodbye, Rose. May you well grow in our hearts. You are the grace that placed yourself.
Number 11, the fall of the Berlin Wall. After World War II, the Allies split Germany into East and West. The Soviet Union controlled the East, while the US, UK, and France controlled the West. Eventually, East and West became separate republics, but the flight of East Germans to the more affluent West prompted the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. Dividing friends and families, the wall became a symbol of the Iron Curtain separating Western Europe and the Soviet bloc. In the 80s, however, massive protests and waves of refugees leaving East Germany led the government to relax rules for immigration. On the evening of November 9, 1989, East Germans gathered at the wall.
Elsewhere, they were swarming over the wall, hacking at it with hammers, picks, and chisels, clawing at it with bare hands.
Rather than open fire, border guards stood down, and the world watched as Germany became one again. Number 10, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. JFK holds a unique place in political history. The World War II veteran was the President of the United States during the Cuban Missile Crisis and the commencement of the space race.
We go into space because whatever mankind must undertake, free men must fully share.
He was also the first Catholic president and was elected off the back of the first televised presidential debates. Yet, despite all of this, his time in office lasted less than 3 years before he was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas on November 22, 1963. Although the moment itself was caught on camera, the footage was not broadcast live. However, the breaking news was delivered to the American people as events transpired.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
The country went into mourning, and millions watched his funeral on television.
Now that he is relieved of the almost superhuman burden we imposed on him, may he rest in peace.
Number 9, the Chernobyl disaster. At first, the details of this disaster were shrouded in secrecy.
There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened.
But word soon got out. During a safety test on April 26, 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant near Pripyat in Soviet Ukraine went into meltdown. The fault of design flaws and negligent operators. The subsequent explosion threw radioactive particles into the atmosphere. It was Sweden who alerted the world 2 days later, when radiation hundreds of miles away set off alarms.
The first word that something was seriously wrong came from this power plant in eastern Sweden, where workers coming on the job registered abnormally high levels of radiation.
As the truth was gradually revealed, the scale of the disaster became evident. The meltdown led directly to the deaths of 31 people, and to many more from radiation-induced cancer in the years afterwards. Number 8, the attack on Pearl Harbor. It might be known as the Second World War, but for the first few years, the U.S. waited out the conflict raging across Europe. That all changed on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Several ships were sunk, and 188 aircraft destroyed. Over 2,000 sailors were killed. It was a devastating blow to the United States Pacific Fleet. The following day, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his famous Day of Infamy speech, and Congress declared war on Japan.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The Allies' call for the U.S. to join the war had been answered. Number 7, the Hindenburg disaster. The first major disaster caught on camera. This airship accident transfixed and horrified audiences in the late 1930s. On May 6, 1937, the German airship LZ-129 Hindenburg was docking in New Jersey when it caught fire, resulting in 36 fatalities.
It bursts in the flames. Get it started, get it started. It's fighting and it's crashing. It's crashing terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please.
Watching the airship crash to the ground, radio journalist Herb Morrison summed it up best with his iconic exclamation.
Oh, the humanity.
Despite the carnage, there were survivors, but they couldn't help establish the cause of the fire, which continues to be debated. Whatever the truth, the effect was the end of Zeppelins as a popular form of air travel. Number 6, Victory in Europe Day. After 6 bloody years of battle, the Second World War was finally over in Europe.
Today is Victory in Europe Day.
Berlin had fallen to the Soviet Union's Red Army, and Nazi leader Adolf Hitler had taken his own life. His successor, Admiral Karl Dönitz, authorized Germany's surrender. On May 8, 1945, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill announced victory over fascism, leading to parties on the street in celebration.
Victory Day changes to Victory Night, and the darkening skies over London are lit by the joyous lights of peace. At this great moment in their history, the people of Britain rejoice with their allies in the victory for which every one of them has worked so hard and so long.
Though the effects of the war were still being felt, the jubilation on that day is historic, and several countries still commemorate the date as a public holiday. Number 5, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Just 17 years after the Second World War ended, Cold War tensions between the US and Soviet Union almost triggered another one, this time nuclear. In response to the US deploying nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey, the Soviet Union did the same in Cuba in 1962. Cuba was keen for Soviet help after the U.S. had backed a failed invasion the previous year.
That a series of offensive missile sites
is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
Despite being advised to launch an airstrike and invasion, President John F. Kennedy opted for a more diplomatic approach, a naval quarantine preventing delivery of more missiles.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
After tense talks, Kennedy and Soviet First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev agreed to scale back their nuclear missiles. But for just over 1 month, the world stood on the brink of nuclear catastrophe. Number 4, the Apollo 11 moon landing. It really was one giant leap for mankind. Back in the 1960s, the idea of sending people to the moon still seemed like science fiction.
6, 5, 3, 2, 1.
But, spurred on by the space race between the US and Soviet Union, NASA's Apollo lunar module Eagle touched down on the moon's surface on July 20th, 1969.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first person to walk on the moon, and Buzz Aldrin the second. An estimated 650 million Earthlings tuned in to witness the event on TV. Despite all our divisions, in that moment, the world watched together in awe as we achieved something we never thought possible.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Number 3. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. While World War II ended in Europe on May 8, 1945, the Allies continued to fight against Japan. On August 6th, after the Japanese refused to surrender, the United States dropped an atomic bomb, known as Fat Man, on the Japanese city of Hiroshima.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
3 days later, they dropped a second, known as Little Boy, on Nagasaki. The bombs vaporized many in the blast radius and inflicted radiation burns and sickness on others, killing an estimated 129,000 to 226,000 people, mostly civilians. Japan surrendered on August 15th. Initially, the horrors of the attacks were little reported, but slowly, images and footage began to reveal the hellish consequences of atomic warfare.
It's important, I think, that we understand the misery and terror and death that it caused.
Number 2, 9/11. Just about everyone who's old enough to remember it can tell you where they were when they heard about the September 11th attacks in 2001.
And we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows.
For New York, it was morning when 2 hijacked passenger jets crashed into and ultimately demolished the Twin Towers as part of a coordinated attack. Another plane hit the Pentagon. After news of a 4th crash came to light that day, it became apparent that the passengers of United Airlines Flight 93 took back their flight and downed the weaponized aircraft before it reached Washington, D.C.
You could hear him yelling, "In the cockpit, the cockpit."
The event claimed close to 3,000 lives, and the world was forever changed.
The other trade center's down. It's down. It's down.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into your settings and switch on notifications. Number 1, the COVID-19 pandemic. On March 12, 2020, the World Health Organization announced that the COVID-19 outbreak had become a pandemic.
We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
At the time, few of us fully understood what it would mean for our lives in the years to come. Nonetheless, the news had people worldwide glued to their screens or running to stock up on groceries, especially toilet paper.
To ensure compliance with the government's instruction to stay at home, we will immediately close all shops selling non-essential goods.
Through lockdowns, the world watched as the virus continued to dominate headlines, and the death toll skyrocketed from the hundreds into the thousands and then millions. The WHO's announcement was the beginning of a long, rocky road for all of us.
Boosters are important, but the most important thing we need to do is get more people vaccinated.
What world-altering events made you stand still? Let us know in the comments below.
It's a cold case, basically. I mean, it's the files still exist. The people who looked into it are still around, but they've sort of put it on the back burner.